The sound of something breaking echoes in the dark. A small wooden horse falls to the ground and breaks in half silence. Then, a short breath, nervous, childish. And then, the phrase that should never have been uttered. If you cry, no one will save you. Abrupt cut. We now see an adult general, imposing, with a gaze as hard as wrought iron. Thousands fear him. Thousands obey him. And no one, absolutely no one, imagines that all that cruelty began with that destroyed toy. And with a promise made in the dark. An entire empire shaped by a trauma hidden behind a locked door in memory. Because, sometimes, the tyrant is not born on the battlefield. He is born in the room where he learned to swallow his own fear. And today, you will discover the childhood trauma that transformed a simple boy into the greatest tyrant in history. They say every tyrant harbors a secret, but his was so deep, so buried, that not even historians dared to touch it for decades. A secret that wasn't recorded in books, nor mentioned in letters, nor revealed in speeches. It was hidden in a much more dangerous place, in the forgotten corners of childhood. Imagine a boy sitting in a silent room. There is no laughter, no toys scattered around, no smell of cake or affection. There is only the clock. Tick, tock, tick, tock, marking time as if in a hurry to transform it into something else. Something harder, colder, more feared. This boy, before becoming a general, before becoming a tyrant, before becoming a myth, was just a child trying to survive someone who should have loved him. And here is born the psychological mystery that few dare to face. How can such a small, seemingly banal trauma become the trigger for atrocities that span centuries? We haven't talked about wars yet. We're not talking about massacres. We're not talking about absolute power. We're talking about a simple gesture. A gesture as quick as it was cruel. The moment when the only toy the boy possessed was destroyed by the hands of the one he feared most. And it wasn't just a wooden toy. It was what remained of his childhood. It was the symbol of the last thing that made him human. When that horse broke in half, something inside him also broke. But unlike the toy, no one could glue it back together. The psychological records we will analyze reveal something terrifying. It wasn't just pain, it was conditioning. That child learned that feeling was dangerous. That crying meant punishment. That showing weakness was opening the door to the enemy. And this is where the question that haunts every study of his life is born. Is a tyrant merely the adult version of a child who was forbidden to feel? The signs appear early. Glances that avoid contact. Silences to long for their age. Small rituals of control aligning objects. Closing doors 3 times. Counting steps before entering a room. All of this was a desperate attempt to create order where there was only chaos. The mystery deepens even further when we discover that, years later, as an adult, he kept the same broken object stored in a secret box. Not to remember, but to never forget what transformed him. Why would someone with absolute power keep something so insignificant? Because it wasn't a memory. It was fuel. A reminder that the world deserves to be controlled in the same way he was controlled. A reminder that vulnerability is the enemy, and that love is a fatal weakness. Today, we will open this box. We will descend to the depths of this shattered childhood, and we will understand the dark mechanism that made such a silent trauma echo across entire continents. Because before understanding the tyrant, we need to understand the boy. He tried to kill within himself. The first concrete clue about the trauma emerged years later, when historians found a diary written by someone very close to the boy. The pages were yellowed, stained, some violently torn out as if someone had tried to erase memories that still burned. But one sentence remained intact, written with a firmness that didn't match the trembling hand of the person who wrote it. He learned too early that fear is the only teacher that never fails. And it was from this sentence that the tension began to build like a psychological labyrinth. The boy grew up in a house where silence had weight, where footsteps in the hallway meant danger, where the shadow of an adult was enough to chill the heart. It was in that environment that his emotional world narrowed, as if each day erased another color from the palette of childhood. And then came the second revelation. Testimonies from former neighbors reported that, at 8 years old, he stopped speaking for almost 3 months. It wasn't physical mutism. It was a silent pact with his own mind. If he didn't speak, no one could use his words against him. This silence shaped something dangerous, the ability to observe everything, to calculate, to predict intentions, to swallow emotions as if they were poison that needed to be ingested to survive. But the real tension begins when we understand how the trauma evolved, transforming into behavior. At 12 years old, he already demonstrated a pattern that frightened even his teachers. He never lost. If he lost a game, he would break the board. If he got a low grade, he would stay up all night, repeating the material until exhaustion. If someone contradicted him, his eyes would become cold, lifeless, as if he were analyzing something invisible. It wasn't ambition. It was defense. It was control. It was the creation of an internal world where no one else would have power over him. Emotional cliffhanger. An unpublished account reveals that he once found another boy crying in the schoolyard. Instead of comforting him, he said the same phrase he had heard in childhood: "If you cry, no one will save you." The same phrase, the same intonation, as if he were passing on the code that had imprisoned him. But the point where the tension really tightens is this: at 15, something happened that most biographies try to soften, but which, psychologically, is the key piece. He confronted the figure who traumatized him, and in the confrontation, for the first time, his eyes did not show fear. They showed something worse: indifference. When a traumatized child ceases to fear their aggressor, it does not mean healing. It means transformation. The fear does not disappear, it turns into something else. Into a need for control, into an obsession with power, into an inability to trust. A professor from that time recounts that, shortly after this event, the young man began to talk about creating order in the world, about eliminating weaknesses, about building something that no one could destroy. No one paid attention at the time, but those were the seeds of a tyrant in the making. The tension reaches its pre-turning point when we discover one last detail years later. Already in the army, he maintained the habit of breaking an object before each battle, a ritual that few saw, a ritual that he never explained, but which had a clear origin: to repeat the moment when he learned that the world only respects those who inflict pain. The trauma was not just a memory, it was a compass, it was fuel, it was a prophecy being fulfilled. Before we understand the tyrant he became, we need to enter the invisible architecture of the traumatized mind, because what transformed him was not a single event, but a psychological circuit that was built brick by brick within him, and which would later manifest itself in devastating historical decisions. Modern psychology explains that children who grow up in constant fear develop something called hypervigilance and extreme attention to every detail, every sound, every change in the other person's facial expression. In his case, this evolved into something even more intense: the ability to anticipate threats before they even existed. And this ability, as distorted as it was powerful, became fundamental when he joined the army. There are records showing how, even as a young man, he predicted enemy attacks with alarming accuracy. While other soldiers slept, he stayed awake observing wind patterns, noises in the woods, the tension in animal behavior. This wasn't military talent. It was the survival instinct of a child who grew up expecting the next blow. Another important psychological phenomenon comes into play here: emotional dissociation. Traumatized children learn to switch off parts of their emotions to cope with the pain. With him, this dissociation became a weapon. Witnesses report that, during the first conflicts, while his colleagues trembled with fear, he seemed empty. There was no hesitation. There was no guilt. The complete absence of empathy, typical of a neglected childhood, made his decisions militarily efficient, but morally catastrophic. But the most dangerous aspect of trauma emerges when we understand the concept of compulsive repetition. Freud described this as the human tendency to unconsciously relive one's own trauma, not to suffer, but to try to overcome it. And that is exactly what he did, only on a historical scale. The boy who couldn't control his own home grew up determined to control the world. The young man whose toy was destroyed went on to destroy entire cities, not out of gratuitous cruelty, but because, psychologically, becoming the aggressor was his way of ensuring he would never again be the victim. His public speeches bear this mark. Phrases that echo his childhood. Weakness is the root of all evil. The world belongs to those who do not tremble. Pain shapes the great. These weren't political slogans. They were disguised memories. A documented episode clearly demonstrates this. During a decisive battle, one of his generals hesitated to attack. The tyrant approached, looked the man in the eye, and said, "When you fear, you surrender control to the enemy." The same logic he learned at the age of 7. The same logic that destroyed his childhood. Psychology calls this trauma transference, when an individual has unresolved pain is dumped onto everyone around them, as if the whole world needs to pay for the original wound. And then we arrive at the central point. Childhood trauma didn't just transform his mind, it transformed his leadership style, his worldview, his military strategies, and his inability to trust anyone. Every betrayal he imagined, real or not, was a projection of that adult who terrorized him in childhood. Every show of force was a way of saying to the past, "I beat you," even though, inside, he was still the boy in front of the broken wooden horse. And this terrible fusion of pain and power, of fear and control, of childhood and war, is what would make possible the darkest turn in his story. The story seemed to follow a predictable pattern. A wounded boy, a hardened young man, a ruthless leader. But what definitively transformed him into a tyrant was not the trauma itself. It was the moment when the trauma came back to haunt him. The first dramatic turn occurs when a newly discovered military document reveals something surprising. Years before assuming absolute power, he received a letter written by the same person who destroyed his toy in childhood. The handwriting was recognizable, the words cutting, the message a plea for forgiveness. But here's the shock. He didn't open the letter. He kept it sealed. He hid it in a lockbox, and the next day, he launched his most violent military campaign. Psychologists who analyzed the case believe that the request for forgiveness threatened his inner equilibrium. To forgive would mean admitting the pain, and admitting the pain would mean dismantling the armor that kept him whole. Thus, instead of confronting the past, he destroyed any possibility of reconciliation with it. That is the first turning point. The tyrant wasn't born from trauma, he was born from the refusal to heal it. The second turning point happens on the battlefield. For years, it was believed that his most brutal strategy surrounding cities and cutting off supplies was purely military. But records reveal that this method began to be used soon after a disturbing episode. A subordinate commented that the tyrant seemed vulnerable in a meeting. That phrase struck him like a ghost from childhood, and, in response, he ordered an operation so cold, so calculated, that historians see in it a definitive change in his behavior. It wasn't tactics, it was symbolic revenge. It was the echo of a child who learned that vulnerability is punishment. The third dramatic twist is even darker. There is an eyewitness, now over 90 years old, who claims to have seen the tyrant breaking something before making important decisions. She recounts a pattern. Every time the general isolated himself in his tent, he would emerge minutes later with a blank stare and a small destroyed object on the table. The twist: he didn't break weapons. He didn't break tools. He didn't break enemy symbols. He broke toys, small ones, handmade ones, as if recreating the most painful moment of his childhood before committing each act of violence. This habit was confirmed by writings found in a safe after his fall. Among them, a phrase that changes everything: "I repeat what taught me not to feel." Here the narrative takes a dramatic turn. He wasn't just reliving the trauma. He was becoming the trauma. He was reproducing the pain that shaped him, now on a political, military, and historical scale. The fourth twist comes when his own advisors begin to fear him. They believed they were working for a brilliant strategist, but they realized that, in critical moments, he wasn't reacting to the external enemy. He was reacting to the internal enemy, the ghost of the figure that terrified him in childhood. When someone challenged him, he didn't see a political opponent. He saw that adult from his memory. When someone showed weakness, he didn't see an ally who needed support. He saw the version of himself he had tried to erase. This culminates in the final twist of this phase. He ordered the arrest of one of his most loyal generals, not for treason, but because the man cried in front of him. The same scene from childhood, the same repeated phrase, the same inability to tolerate what he himself was forbidden to feel. And it is here that we perceive the truth. Devastating. The tyrant the world feared was not just a cruel man. It was a wounded child commanding an army of shadows. And this child was about to lead the world to the darkest climax of its history. We have reached the decisive moment. The night when everything he had spent his entire life trying to hide finally caught up with him. The scene is recorded by several independent accounts. The tyrant was alone in his tent, just hours away from fighting the most important battle of his career. Outside, his soldiers awaited orders. Inside, he stared at something tiny, simple, insignificant to anyone else, but which, for him, was the abyss itself. A wooden horse, carefully carved, identical to the one from his childhood. Historians have never been able to determine if it was the original toy or a copy. But what mattered was not the object, it was what it represented. He held it tightly, as if the past fit between his fingers. His breathing was irregular, his eyes always cold, always impenetrable, trembled for the first time in decades. And then it happened. The sound, that sound that had echoed in his mind since he was 7 years old, cracked. The toy broke in half, and in that instant, something inside him also broke, but not like before. This time, there was no transformation, no reinforcement of the armor, no escape to war or to power. This time, there was memory. Everything returned with the force of an avalanche, the face of the aggressor, the feeling of powerlessness, the fear that paralyzed him, the phrase that haunted him throughout his life. He fell to his knees. For the first time, the tyrant seemed human. There were no subjects. There were no soldiers. There were no enemies. There was only a man facing his own scar. And, in a moment none of those present ever forgot, he murmured something almost inaudible. "I didn't want to be like this." That whisper tore apart everything we knew about him. The greatest tyrant in history, at the height of his power, confessing even if only to himself that he didn't choose the monster he became, that he was molded, that he was pushed, that he was broken before he even learned to live. But the tragedy doesn't end there, because right after that fraction of vulnerability came the final stage of the trauma, the final denial. The tyrant slowly stood up, raised his face, dried the tears he would never admit to having shed, and stepped on the broken toy. The crack of the crushed wood became a symbol, a manifesto, the definitive death of the child within him. When he left his tent, his troops felt a strange silence, as if something had changed in the air. He looked at everyone, but seemed to see no one. It was as if he had crossed a portal and returned soulless. And then came the order no one expected, a total, immediate, suicidal attack, an irrational, unthinkable, desperate strategy that only made sense to a man who had decided to destroy even his own history. Psychologists explain that that moment represents the peak of the internal collision, when the repressed trauma finally finds consciousness, but the person lacks the emotional tools to integrate it, and instead of healing, destruction follows. The battle that followed was the bloodiest of his life. Several accounts say he fought on the front lines, something he hadn't done in years, as if seeking death, as if he wanted to erase once and for all the boy who still screamed inside him. And in that field, surrounded by fire, dust, and bodies, the tyrant finally fell, not by the hands of a hero, not by political betrayal, but by the inevitable consequences of a life built on a wound that never healed. The climax is not his death. The climax is what it reveals. No monster is born a monster. It is manufactured, molded, tempered by hands that should have offered love and offered fear. The war ended there, but the trauma that continued to echo in history, the story ends on the battlefield. But the real question begins long before that. It begins in the place where humanity is usually born and where, sometimes, it is murdered: childhood. The tyrant who entered the history books as a symbol of absolute cruelty was not just a product of ambition, politics, or war. He was a product of something more silent, more invisible, more universal, an emotional wound so deep that it grew along with him. And when we look at his entire trajectory, something unsettling happens. We realize that evil doesn't arise like a meteor, exploding out of nowhere. It begins as a crack, small, almost imperceptible, a moment of pain that no one saw, no one treated, no one knew how to prevent. The question that echoes, then, is brutal. How many tyrants could have been avoided if someone had offered love at the right moment? Psychology tries to explain, history tries to record, society tries to forget. But there is a truth we cannot ignore. Childhood is humanity's most decisive battlefield. The place where courage is created, or monsters. The tyrant in our story never chose to be a tyrant. He chose to survive. And in doing so, he lost himself. He transformed fear into power, pain into strategy, vulnerability into violence, until his own soul became unrecognizable to himself. And in the end, when he held that broken wooden horse, it wasn't the general, the leader, the symbol that was there. It was just a man facing the boy he abandoned. And that's the most disturbing point of all. No matter how high someone climbs, trauma always finds a way to catch up. The story of the world's greatest tyrant isn't just about destruction. It's about the brutal force that a single moment can exert on an entire life. It's about how pain shapes decisions, relationships, wars. It's about the danger of denying what we feel, because everything that is repressed returns, and when it returns, it exacts interest. Ultimately, his legacy isn't just in the battles he won, the cities he conquered, or the enemies he defeated. The true legacy lies in the question he left us. What would happen if we dealt with trauma before it became history? This story isn't a monument to the tyrant. It's a mirror for us, for our choices, for our wounds, for the children we were, and for the adults we are still becoming. If you've made it this far, my sincere thanks. Stories like this require courage to watch and even more to understand. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other profound narratives like this one. Leave a like, because that helps YouTube show our content to more people. Comment below. What part of this story impacted you the most? Do you believe that trauma can truly shape someone's destiny? And before you leave, don't forget to watch the video that's currently playing on the screen. It is even more intriguing, deeper, and more captivating than this one. Click and continue the journey.